The weather was pleasantly warm as residents of the small town filled the streets, greeting one another and asking about each other's well-being. Children played outside under their parents' watchful eyes. Suddenly, an unknown man in a dark cloak appeared near a little girl running happily toward her mother. The child examined the stranger with surprise and asked her mother with interest if this was the person she'd been thinking of. The woman dismissed her daughter with a cluck, glancing at the short man dressed in dark robes. She ordered her daughter not to look at him. The people around regarded the familiar man with equal disdain, watching in disgust as the corpse collector moved toward the shopping plaza. After some time, he arrived near one of the commercial buildings at the center. From the signboard's name, it was clear the local merchant was a miser dealing in various junk. The old man sitting behind the counter looked toward the entrance with irritation as the door opened. When he saw the cloaked figure, he asked why the corpse collector had come to see him this time. Other visitors also looked at the man with rejection. As the boy approached the counter, the other customers hurried toward the exit. The young man pulled a sack from within his cloak, unfolded it, and dumped bones, claws, and feathers onto the tabletop. He stated he wanted to sell everything. The miser examined the unexpected merchandise and thought the kid had brought him trash again. A moment later, he pulled a few bronze coins from his pocket, tossed them on the table, said he wouldn't give more for this junk, and ordered the boy to leave. The young man looked at those pennies in surprise, realizing he'd only been given 20% of the usual price. Furious, he asked the salesman why he was paid so little this time. Suddenly, the old man called the boy a miserable bastard and said he had no right to complain since he was just a pathetic corpse collector. In this world, danger awaits anyone at every turn, monsters that people have lived with for decades. However, there are also those who hunt these monsters. Those who dedicate their lives to this perilous path are called adventurers. Such people mine expensive materials daily and fight monsters constantly. By defeating monsters, they increase their level. Even a slight difference in this metric makes a huge difference in strength. After all, level is the foundation of this world. The hero looked at his hands and almost cried. For him, the bitter realization was that in such a cruel world, his level was 1. This young man's name is Ark, and despite his despicable status, he is also an adventurer. After being chased from the store, the boy went to the market square. As he approached a familiar shop, he greeted the old man in an apron and asked if he had some bread for him. The vendor recognized Ark and, pulling a bag from under the counter, said he'd saved some bread he couldn't sell yesterday. The boy felt disappointed but still handed over his hard-earned money, realizing he shouldn't complain. Suddenly, the old man turned to the boy and asked if he should leave his job as an adventurer. This unexpected question left Ark in a stupor. The salesman continued, saying not everyone succeeds in finding their calling the first time, and perhaps the boy could find something better suited to him. Ark barely managed a smile and said he couldn't leave his work. After all, he was the notorious corpse collector, and no one would want to hire him. Ever since childhood, Ark wanted to be an adventurer. But when his dream came true, he learned of his curse. To his great regret, he was among the small number of people who possessed the ability of zero experience. Unlike most adventurers who possessed many useful skills, he had received a special curse. No matter how many times Ark tried to fight monsters, his level never increased. Even when attempting to defeat the weakest slimes, he gained nothing from them. Yet for several years, the hero refused to give up. Time after time, he entered the dungeon, hoping that eventually he would level up. But each foray ended in failure. Ark remained at level 1. In the end, he finally lost all hope. Still, the boy wished to become an adventurer, and he found an unconventional solution. Ark began collecting materials from the corpses of monsters previously defeated by other adventurers. That's when the whole town became aware of him as the notorious corpse collector. Trying to chew the slightly stale bread, Ark thought the materials from first-level monsters were worth too little. He needed to find better monsters. The boy realized that by collecting scraps, he wouldn't be able to survive much longer. Suddenly, several people walked past the protagonist. One of them accidentally bumped into his shoulder. Ark dropped the bread and immediately fell to the ground. The adventurer who'd collided with him saw the familiar cloak. A moment later, he walked over to the dropped bread and stepped on it with his foot. The boy looked up and said that was his last meal. However, the man named Jar looked down on him with contempt. The adventurer immediately recognized the corpse collector. His partners were very pleased with their leader's action. Ark stared at his assailant with an uncomprehending look. Everyone in the city knew him as the corpse collector. Because of this stupid nickname, the boy couldn't find any other job. The hero looked at the trampled loaf and wondered again why this was happening to him. Ark thought frustratedly that his only desire was to follow his dream. Still, no matter how much he was despised, he couldn't stop searching corpses otherwise, he would simply starve to death. The protagonist gazed into the goblin cave, populated mostly by low-level monsters. As he examined the endless ramifications, Ark hoped that at least this time he would find something worthwhile. Suddenly, a horrible stench filled the tunnel directly ahead. The hero thought something must have badly rotted here. When he looked forward, he couldn't believe his eyes. Before him lay a large dragon carcass covered with wounds and beginning to rot. Examining the huge corpse, Ark realized this monster was likely around level 200. The boy thought this wasn't the best time to ponder it. He should finish examining the corpse as soon as possible because he could probably extract some good materials to sell. The corpse collector looked deep into the dragon's innards and realized no one had left him any valuable parts. His attention was drawn to an organ resembling a stomach. Ark realized it usually wasn't touched due to its strong stench, but he wasn't afraid of that. Corpses were his main livelihood. Suddenly, the boy felt something inside the stomach. He was glad there seemed to be something within the organ. Ark immediately prepared a knife to open the stomach. Overcoming all disgust, he thrust the knife in close. After the incision was made, the protagonist couldn't believe his eyes. Inside the decayed organ, there was a gleam. The boy saw an object that looked like armor. Finally cutting the stomach open, Ark realized he'd stumbled upon some armor. Suddenly, several bright lightning bolts burst from the metal breastplate. The boy was startled and jerked backward. Ark figured if this involved something dangerous, he wouldn't be able to resist it. Suddenly, a voice from the cut stomach urged the boy to put on the armor. The boy was very surprised that some armor was talking to him. The terrified hero realized these were definitely dangerous items. Ark decided not to tempt fate, turned around, and headed toward the cave exit. But at the same moment, he noticed someone blocking his path. Several goblins stood right in front of him, waving their hands threateningly in his direction. Ark realized even such a seemingly simple obstacle would be challenging for him. The young man couldn't understand how he hadn't sensed the approach of so many opponents. As he drew his sword and prepared to fight, he realized he would have to pay for his inattention. Ark looked fearfully at the approaching goblins and realized that although they were the same level, his equipment was far too weak. Suddenly, 3 monsters pounced on the protagonist at once. After the goblin's first blow, the boy couldn't keep his sword in his hands. It flew off to the side. He looked fearfully at the monsters again and couldn't believe it would end like this. It was probably the most shameful of all possible outcomes, but now it was inevitable. Ark couldn't believe he would lose his life in a place like this, having accomplished nothing in so many years. But at that instant, the armor suddenly called out to the boy once again, urging the protagonist to put it on. Ark realized he wasn't immortal anyway, and it looked like he'd have to take his chances. With another glance at the goblins, the boy shouted to the armor that he agreed to wear it. At that instant, the monsters attacked the boy again. Looking at the attacking monsters, Ark realized it was better to trust fate completely than to die so easily. Suddenly, the armor responded that the new host's intentions were confirmed and the new owner's registration was complete. the armor shuddered, and a voice announced activation of the fast vestment. Ark turned around and saw several black lightning bolts flying toward him. A moment later, there was a small flash around the protagonist, raising dust in the cave. The goblin stopped and looked at the enemy with surprise. The system announced that the donning of the abyss armor was complete. At that moment, Ark stood before his enemies in his new armor. Peering at the clawed gauntlets, he wondered if this strange armor was on his side. The armor replied that it was on the hero's side. Ark said he would check that out now. In an instant, several goblins swooped down on him at once. In addition to the armor, Ark also received a sword clearly better than his last blade. The boy swung his weapon, and with one blow calmly cut down one of the advancing goblins. In that instant, the monster's entire body was covered in an unknown glow. As the goblin's body fell to the ground, a blob of energy began to flow from its torso toward the protagonist. A moment later, a beam of light pierced Ark's body. He didn't realize what was happening. But there was no time to think, as two more goblins were advancing from the right. Turning around, the hero handled them with equal ease. A smile appeared on his face for the first time in a long while. The carcasses of these monsters also began to emit an unknown glow. Ark only had time to think his body felt very light when two more blobs of energy flew into his body. As he looked at the remaining opponents, he thought he was getting the feeling he was growing stronger and stronger with each blow. The remaining goblins were slaughtered with the same speed. After defeating the last of his opponents, he stopped, trying to figure out how he felt. The first surprise for Ark was that he survived for the first time. He was able to fight back against monsters. But the bigger surprise was that the boy managed to defeat 5 goblins at once while being at level 1. An unknown glow also poured from the bodies of the last monsters. But suddenly, the system notified that the adventurer's level had been raised several times at once. Ark couldn't believe his eyes. He'd just been told he'd raised his current level to 6. The boy stood still, unable to move from shock. Announcements of this nature were new to him, and he didn't understand what it meant. Plus, it was very strange considering he'd had a curse from an early age preventing him from gaining experience to level up. Suddenly, a system screen popped up before the protagonist, notifying him that thanks to the abyss armor, Ark had the ability to use the level absorption skill. The boy had never heard of anything like this before. It was then he saw he had indeed reached level 6. However, it wasn't done by gaining additional experience. Looking at his arm, Ark realized this armor allowed him to steal levels from monsters and other creatures. In that instant, he cried with happiness, not believing what was happening. The boy stood alone in the empty cave, trying to contain his emotions. In that second, Ark realized he was now starting a new life. After calming down somewhat, the boy raised the sword in his hand and realized he'd held the blade before without much difficulty. However, now he had the feeling all actions were easier and faster. In just a few minutes, the protagonist had gained 5 levels at once. Now Ark could quietly go about his advancement without any difficulty. After happily running back and forth across the cave, he stopped to catch his breath. His gaze fell once again on the dragon lying on the ground. Now that he'd leveled up, the smell of that corpse felt even more unpleasant. Still, the protagonist had to pay tribute to this dragon thanks to it. He was able to move to another stage of development. The boy looked around and examined the goblin corpses lying to the side. Suddenly, a startling thought struck him. At that moment, Ark thought that if he defeated the remaining creatures in this cave, he could become many times stronger in a short period. Examining his body once again, he realized that most likely, thanks to this armor, he wouldn't be easily wounded. That was why there was now the perfect moment to kill all the goblins using such an opportunity. But no sooner had the boy thought about it than suddenly loud stomping sounded behind him. Ark saw something huge appear behind his back, casting a shadow over him. The protagonist tried to figure out what kind of feelings he'd just experienced. Looking around, he thought there certainly shouldn't be any strong goblins in this cave. But when Ark saw what appeared behind his back, he was stunned and unable to say a word. The Goblin Lord towered before him. The system indicated his level was 35. A crowd of several dozen smaller goblins had also gathered right behind him. The boy tried to assume a fighting pose, not realizing where one of the higher monsters had come from. After assessing the situation, he realized he definitely wouldn't win this fight and needed to rush to the exit. However, behind his back, several small monsters were already climbing onto the dragon carcass, blocking the exit. The terrified hero realized these creatures were attracted to the smell of rotting meat. Suddenly, the armor warned the wearer that the main opponent was level 35 and recommended retreat. No sooner had Ark thought that escape wouldn't be so easy than the Supreme Goblin struck the first blow. At that instant, the boy managed to deflect it, but he was now in a vulnerable position. The monster, realizing this, immediately attacked again. The protagonist managed to block the blow at the last moment. Yet the force of the goblin's swing was so startling that Ark was thrown several meters aside. The protagonist flew into one of the cave walls with all his might and fell, unable to move. After gathering his wits, the boy barely lifted himself up. He looked straight ahead and saw the high goblin walking toward him. Ark was surprised at the monster's monstrous strength. After looking into the eyes of this horrible creature, the protagonist realized he was still too weak. Being cornered, Ark lost his composure for a moment and shouted with all his might, barely holding back tears. The boy couldn't believe that only a short time ago he'd just succeeded in reaching a new level, and now he was once again in a hopeless situation. Yet after a few more dodges, he still managed to sneak out into one of the narrow passageways. However, there was now the question of how the protagonist would escape this trap. The main exit was guarded by an army of goblins he certainly couldn't handle. Looking around, Ark tried to think of another method to get out of the cave. Noting his weakness once again, he thought one logical way out might be to simply wait for the goblin army to move away from the exit. Suddenly, a knife-wielding monster appeared right in front of the boy in the hallway. This level 1 goblin was all alone and posed no danger at all. After the creature jumped, trying to attack Ark, he grabbed the monster's head. In the next instant, he spun around and smashed the goblin's head against the cave wall. After making sure the enemy was dead, he let go of the breathless body, absorbing the creature's level. The protagonist stated that in this world, level decides everything. He also thought any monster should understand the difference between the two, just as Ark himself understood his difference from the Goblin Lord. While the boy was thinking about it, the system alerted him to a level increase. A blob of energy flowed into the hero's body. Suddenly, Ark came to another thought. After all, at that moment, nothing was stopping him from gaining levels in the dungeon to defeat the Goblin Lord later on. Whereas before he couldn't kill, now everything had changed. In his new reality, he had to kill to survive. A few minutes later, the hallways of the cave erupted in a frenzy of screams. Ark found one goblin after another and immediately cut them down. With each new victim, the level gradually increased. The progression was very fast. After a short period, any goblin ceased to present any difficulty and became merely a chore. Ark would knock out monsters in groups. After that, he waited for the level to be absorbed. He thought with indifference that in this world, only the strongest survive. Those who want to survive must have a high level, and anyone who shows weakness will always obey the strong. Ark knew that from his own experience. After many minutes of carnage, he continued making his way deeper into the caves. By then, he'd already reached level 15. Suddenly, Ark saw a passageway ahead, illuminated by 2 torches. The mysterious branch in the corridor interested the hero. Plus, the armor suddenly said that on its recommendation, he should check out the side caves. The protagonist, intrigued, went toward the passageway, hoping there was something of value there. When he passed through the passage, Ark couldn't believe his eyes. He saw a small room filled to the top with gold coins and various riches. Inspecting the untold wealth, The boy realized the goblins had stolen all these treasures from humans. This wasn't surprising, as ordinary humans cannot cope with even the weakest creatures. Looking around the space, the hero decided to search for something useful. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a strange box to his right. Ark walked over to the interesting object and pulled the cover off. The box was filled to the top with various elixirs. The armor explained it was presumably a recovery potion. The boy took one of the flasks in his hand and, after examining the liquid inside, realized it looked useful. He took a few with him for battle. It was then that Ark learned through the system there was a special space in the armor specifically for potions. Suddenly, the left side of the armor glowed brightly, startling the wearer. After the flash ended, he noticed he now had a special notch for potions. Satisfied, Ark immediately slipped the first flask into the vacant cell, thus emptying the entire container. Mentally thanking the armor after examining the untold riches lying around, the boy thought it would be nice to take a few bags of coins from here, but they would get in the way during battle. Despite his rapid advancement, Ark's main goal now was to return to the city alive and unharmed. Now that the hero was stronger, he'd be able to return and take on the business of selling materials from higher-ranked monsters. But to do so, he had to pass a very difficult test. After pondering a plan of action, Ark decided to set off when suddenly someone's voice came from behind him. The boy was very surprised by this. The voice was clearly human. Turning around, Ark ran toward the boxes from behind, which someone was calling for help. Running around the clutter, he looked around the place where someone had yelled from. Suddenly, the boy saw a frightened girl with bound hands and feet sitting across from him. He realized the goblins seemed to be kidnapping people as well. At the sight of her savior, the girl cried with happiness. Ark decided not to delay and immediately untied the captive. As he untangled the rope, he looked at the girl with a sympathetic expression and said she was very lucky he'd noticed her. The captive, named Mill, who lives in the village of Raro, thanked her rescuer heartily. Just then, she shyly asked the stranger what his name was. The protagonist hesitated to answer, realizing he was also known in that village. After gathering his strength, he answered that his name was Ark. The girl was horrified for a moment and recognized who stood before her. Seeing that Mill was shocked, the protagonist explained that everyone knows him as the corpse collector. The girl said confusedly she'd heard of such a man from town rumors. At that instant, she looked down and saw the rope untied. Her face instantly filled with joy. Mill learned you shouldn't judge people based on rumors. She confidently stated to Ark that he was completely different from what was being told about him throughout the neighborhood. The protagonist was surprised by this. He turned around, asking what she meant. The girl happily said he'd just saved her life. And even based on that fact, in her opinion, the boy didn't look at all like some corpse collector. Mill smiled and said that for her, Ark was now a hero. These words from the person he rescued had a profound effect on the boy. All his life, he'd wanted to be an adventurer who saves people from danger. Looking at the girl who'd collected a few gold coins in her purse, he said it was time for them to go. Turning his back to Mill, Ark said he would walk the girl to the village. The rescued child asked the boy what he just said. However, the boy simply said to follow him. The protagonist thought that even if only a little, he was happier. The travelers progressed down the long corridors toward the exit. Suddenly, a powerful roar was heard ahead, making the blood run cold. Ark turned to Mill and said she needed to sit behind the rocks for a while and keep her head down. Looking ahead again, the boy realized there were many goblins ahead, perhaps even a whole army. The protagonist wasn't mistaken in his assessment. In a few seconds, a large squad of monsters appeared in the darkness. Their numbers were very large, and they walked confidently toward the uninvited guests. Drawing his sword and preparing for battle, Ark assessed the composition of his opponents, counting about 20 level 1 goblins. Mentally, he thought these goblins had better get ready. Pointing the blade toward his opponents, he said they would soon be his levels. After these words, the goblins instantly ran toward the boy, waving their weapons and shouting at the top of their voices. Ark immediately went into battle mode, starting to slaughter one monster after another. The speed and strength of the blade allowed him to dominate this battle unchallenged. The protagonist spared no one. It seemed he was getting even for the years of humiliation he'd experienced before. One by one, the goblins' bodies began turning into experience. Blobs of energy were directed toward the player time after time, and the system announced level increases. As he continued to chop his opponents to pieces, Ark realized he was attacking faster and faster thanks to his level increases. In addition, the protagonist developed a reaction that allowed him to immediately interrupt all monster attacks. Suddenly, the kid was attacked from behind by 4 goblins at once. Ark reacted easily to the unexpected situation and soared upward in one leap. After staying in the air for a few seconds, he once again descended upon the monsters, slicing them one by one. Time after time, the system continued to notify level increases. Now he could just have fun with his opponents. Tossing one of the goblins aloft, Ark rushed after it. In the next instant, a moment later, he sliced that opponent in half as well. The monsters on the ground looked up with surprise. The boy flashed a glance, determining his next targets. The goblins, seeing the confidence appear on their opponent's face, seemed to realize they didn't stand a chance. In the next instant, several swift blows wiped out the remaining group. After a couple of seconds, Ark stopped, finding himself among the cut corpses of goblins. The system started recalculating the owner's level, and then raised this indicator to 35 units. Mill looked out from behind the rock fearfully and asked if she could come out. However, the main character said it wasn't time yet. After these words, the girl looked around fearfully, thinking another monster was lurking somewhere. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard in the distance. Ark looked away, surprised the Goblin Lord had come only now after so much of his kin's blood had been spilled. Opposite the boy towered a huge creature holding a massive cleaver in his hand. The goblin was many times larger than Ark. He seemed able to crush the protagonist with just one of his feet. The boy decided now was the moment when he would defeat the Goblin Lord. The monster cocked its head upward and shrieked furiously at the sight of the stranger. Ark shouted he was no longer the weakling who'd cowardly fled not so long ago. Immediately after saying that, the Goblin Lord readied his cleaver and swung it around to attack first. The boy shouted again to his soulless opponent not to think the battle would be easy. The moment his opponent swung for a strike, the protagonist attacked first, slashing into the monster's stomach. The creature immediately grabbed the affected spot and shouted in rage throughout the cave. Finding himself behind the enemy's back, the protagonist immediately found himself surrounded by several more smaller goblins. After counting the small monsters, he realized there were no more than 10 of them. Accordingly, they wouldn't be much trouble. With that thought, the boy figured that as long as the Goblin Lord was still alive, he didn't want to be distracted by any minions. That's when the main character called out to Mill and told her to throw knives at him. The girl grabbed a belt of throwing blades from the ground and immediately turned around. Swinging, she hurled the equipment in the direction of her savior. In flight, most of the knives fell out of their cells and flew chaotically toward Ark. Mill, realizing she'd made a big mistake, shouted for him to excuse her. However, the confident boy said it was nothing. Moments later, he jumped up and caught 2 daggers while surveying the battlefield. With his first throw, Ark accurately pierced 2 goblins at once. The hero then changed his position slightly to make it more convenient to catch the remaining daggers. Taking aim, he again spotted monsters standing next to each other and also killed 2 of them with a single throw. Ark then ran past the remaining 6 goblins, picking up falling blades along the way. A few seconds later, he stopped before the crowd, holding the 6 knives he'd caught. The protagonist looked at his opponents and muttered that today just wasn't their day. He then added confidently that no one should disturb him when he was at work. Swinging around, Ark shouted that the servants' desire to help their master had only made their situation worse. A second later, he swung his arms and released all 6 daggers at once, which struck the remaining 6 goblins. After making sure all the minions were dead, the hero reached for his sword again, seeing the notification that his level had been raised to 45. Suddenly, a powerful roar sounded from behind the boy's back. It turned out the Goblin Lord, who'd already regained consciousness, found himself behind Ark's back. At that moment, the monster attacked his opponent. The young man only raised his sword above his head, not even turning to his opponent. Initially, the hero thought that since his level was now higher than that big guy's, it should be easier for him. However, the large monster seemed to be getting stronger blow by blow. The incessant attack forced the boy to back off somewhat. He didn't understand how the wounded goblin continued to exert such pressure. As a result, the boy backed away, catching his breath and thinking about what he should do next. Suddenly, the armor alerted that the monster had an artifact increasing its performance in battle. In the case of the Goblin Lord, it was the bracelet on his right arm. That's when Ark saw what the artifact was and immediately understood everything. After some time, any adventurer has a situation where they can't raise their level as easily. To do this, all adventurers use a variety of artifacts that enhance one or more characteristics. But Ark couldn't even guess monsters could also use such things to improve their fighting ability. The boy prepared for battle and realized his purpose was now clear. Without destroying this bracelet, he wouldn't be able to win the battle. Therefore, it was necessary to attack the artifact first. The monster once again threw a reckless strike, which Ark easily dodged. Yet after the creature applied the artifact, its speed also increased, and getting the bracelet wouldn't be easy. It looked like the hero would have to go all out to win. Ark lunged at the monster once more. The goblin immediately blocked his blow. At the same time, the boy put all his strength into this strike, hoping to break through the block the monster had put up. It was obvious from the high goblin's face that it was having a hard time repelling this attack. At some point, however, it prepared for a counterattack by taking a different position. At that instant, it swung with its cleaver, tossing the boy aside. Ark couldn't do anything with that much force and flew off to the side. This time, however, he managed to group himself in midair, and he didn't hurt himself on landing. His attention was drawn to the daggers stuck into the bodies of the minions he'd recently killed. Picking up 2 throwing knives, he thought of another option to get close to the monster's amulet. As a distraction, he threw a knife at his opponent on the run. The thug easily repelled the throw with the blade of his cleaver. Then Ark threw another blade on the run, so he had a chance to get even closer. This time, the knife hit the handle of the cleaver, but still didn't do any damage to the thug. But the point was just that these throws helped the protagonist get as close to the enemy as possible. Seeing the boy in front of his face, the high goblin held out his cleaver in front of him, blocking the passage to vulnerable areas. After the monster fended off his blow, Ark soared upward, aiming for the final blow. The boy flew toward the ground at great speed and was behind the monster's back. As he flew, he muttered that the most important thing in battle was to stay alert. The Supreme Goblin had time to see the approaching danger. However, it was difficult to react to it. Nevertheless, the creature turned around and tried to block this unexpected attack with its right hand. That's when the blade struck the artifact. Having finished the first phase of the battle, Ark jumped to the ground. The enormous goblin still loomed before him, but its face no longer had such confidence on it. Confident in his future victory, the protagonist muttered he wouldn't tolerate any surprises now. As a last chance, Ark offered to let the Goblin Lord escape, at least if it could do so. However, the monster didn't even back up. After saying that, on the contrary, it took a few steps toward the boy. The adventurer realized that in such a case, the outcome of the fight was already predetermined and rushed toward the thug. Taking advantage of the surprise effect and speed advantage, Ark flanked and swung his sword. The goblin had time to react to this sudden attack, but now their forces were completely unequal. The monster flew several dozen meters into the nearest wall after blocking the blow. Blood gushed from its mouth from the force of the impact. Ark walked up to his almost defeated opponent and asked what was the matter now. Was it really afraid of him? The boy shouted that the creature's life was now at stake and threw several swift blows. During one of the attacks, the Goblin Lord dropped his cleaver, which flew off to the side. It was a few meters away and stabbed its blade into the stone floor. Ark looked at his opponent and realized this was his big chance. If he defeated this huge monster, he would be rid of his weakness and society's ridicule forever. However, the monster didn't seem about to give up. In the next second, it tried to hit the young man with its fist. However, the boy was ahead of the enemy and plunged his sword into the monster's body first. The huge carcass of the defeated enemy began to fall forward by inertia. Ark said he would be much stronger because of this battle. The large creature collapsed to the ground with its whole body, raising a large cloud of dust. Meanwhile, the young man thanked his opponent for the opportunity. Dozens of small clots of energy began to emerge from the monster's body. One by one, they headed toward the hero's body, gradually raising his level. After a while, the system once again recalculated Ark's experience. Now he'd reached level 80. The boy looked toward the cliff where he'd left his companion and said she could come out now. The girl walked over and looked in surprise at the carcass of the defeated monster. She couldn't believe a man everyone around her had recently known as a corpse collector could now defeat such a powerful creature. Unexpectedly, Mill cheerfully said Ark was now the strongest adventurer of the era. Such a title flattered and surprised him at the same time. After a while, he began to dismember the monster's huge body. In the end, he managed to take the large fang of the Supreme Goblin as a nice trophy. Looking longingly at the long-awaited prize, the boy couldn't believe the day would come when he would obtain such a rare material. Suddenly, Mill held out her hand and said she could carry all this stuff in her sack. Ark trusted the rescued girl without a second thought. Besides the fang, he also gave her the cursed bone and the sword of the Goblin Lord. He thanked the girl for helping him with the materials, to which his companion replied it wasn't difficult for her because the boy had saved her life. Suddenly, Mill asked what they were going to do with that huge monster body. Ark replied he'd already collected all the good materials that could be extracted from it. The hero thought that now, with this armor and his new high level, he no longer needed to hide from anyone and could safely return to the village. The girl immediately said that if they left even one of the living goblins here, the kidnappings from the village might continue again. These words had a powerful effect on Ark. He realized he could now earn the village's respect again by saving its people from the monsters. The boy turned toward the corridors going deep into the cave and asked Mill if she would stay with him a little longer. The girl answered she didn't mind but asked where they were going to go. Ark replied his main concern now was to prevent the kidnappings from continuing, so he decided the right thing would be to kill all the goblins in this cave so they wouldn't bother anyone else. A short while later, the two companions returned to the village. He was surprised at the fact he'd made a significant amount of experience gains in the last 24 hours. When he'd left the village, he was only level 1, but now he was already level 100. Besides, with so much experience, he was now able to handle almost any monster in the immediate area. The boy glowed at the thought he could now be called the ultimate adventurer. A tired Mill asked her savior what he'd just said, and the boy recounted his thoughts to her. After a few seconds, the girl yelled out she'd never seen adventurers with triple-digit levels in her life. She replied in surprise the guy was definitely not a newcomer, but instead the strongest adventurer of the village. For his part, Ark couldn't answer anything. He himself had never seen adventurers with such a level. Looking at his companion, he said she was absolutely right about everything. It was then the boy reflected he must now move on somewhere else, as the local neighborhoods were no longer of such use to him for his advancement. The protagonist recalled how he'd shown Mill his ability to absorb opponent levels. The companion was clearly surprised by this. The girl muttered that with such strength, Ark could become even much stronger. She smiled sweetly at her rescuer and said she would keep her fists up for him from now on. Suddenly, from the side, someone approached and marveled at the scene taking place before him. It was just the adventurer named Jar with his troop. He said hello to the corpse collector. Ark looked coldly at his opponent and grudgingly greeted him back. The white-haired guy asked his interlocutor rudely what was that armor he was wearing and where did he get it from. Without waiting for an answer, he chuckled and realized the boy couldn't rely on his curse and decided to fix that problem with armor. Mockingly, with a wave of his hand, Jar said anyone who was ever a corpse collector would always remain trash. The adventurer added confidently the boy would remain a level 1 weakling, and no amount of armor would fix that flaw. However, while his opponent taunted him, Ark wasted no time and decided to move from words to action. A moment later, the protagonist was in front of Jar, thrusting one of his daggers forward. In the same second, he said he was sick of all this. With a cold look at the arrogant adventurer, Ark said he was bored with all this talk and ordered the boy to shut up. The white-haired guy stared at the weakling who was now suddenly right in front of him with a knife at the ready. He looked angrily at the boy and said a freak always stays trash. A moment later, Jar snapped out of this threatening state and found himself at Ark's side. An attempted leg kick was unsuccessful, and the protagonist calmly blocked the attack. The devastated Jar shouted he wouldn't let some snotty corpse collector get cocky. With those words, he reached for his sword. But no sooner had he taken out his blade than he was immediately thrown into a chill by what had happened. Ark was already standing in front of him. The hero anticipated his opponent would reach for his weapon and immediately knocked the blade out of his hands. Jar sat on the ground and shouted this simply couldn't be. His aides had already circled the enemy from behind and had drawn their blades, but they were still hesitant to attack. Ark turned to the adventurers and asked coldly if they really wanted to try it too. Both fighters were dumbfounded and didn't dare to move. Jar, sitting on the ground, exclaimed he was already level 20, and he'd been defeated by some corpse collector. He realized the rumor of his defeat to a level 1 weakling would spread throughout the village and town. Upon hearing that Jar was only level 20, Ark laughed and called his opponent a weakling, saying he was several times weaker than him. Suddenly, one of the adventurers standing aside, trembling with his whole body, asked his superior to check the level of this weakling. The guy lifted himself off the ground and opened the information panel, not realizing what the problem could be. But what he saw plunged him into the deepest horror. Jar shook his whole body and couldn't understand why this weakling had suddenly obtained the 100th level. The boy looked up fearfully at the man he'd wronged for so many years in a row. In a trembling voice, he asked if it was really true and how did Ark turn into such a monster. The main character exhaled and said that first, everyone called him a corpse collector, and now someone was going to call him a monster. Then he looked with a merry expression at his opponents and said he was only the simplest of adventurers. However, it suddenly appeared there was no one at the place where Jar had been sitting a second ago. All three of them ran off without a backward glance, shouting they didn't want to mess with that monster anymore. He was surprised at how fast they could run when they were in danger. A tired Mill looked at her savior and said it seemed Ark had really changed. She smiled sweetly at him again and said she was very happy for him. It was as if the girl had a burst of strength, and she ran aside and called the boy after her. Seeing a companion on the village street, Mill suggested everyone around him spread the word about his new abilities. A few minutes later, the door of the hoarder's store swung open abruptly. The old man looked through the doorway and saw the man everyone knows as the corpse collector. Not holding out any hopes but peering at the armor, the hoarder said he was willing to listen to suggestions. The boy, with a smile on his face, walked up to the counter and said he once again wanted to sell materials. When the protagonist came closer, the old man marveled at how the guy had changed in such a short period. Still, he looked at the regular visitor and said the kid probably brought some trash and shouldn't waste their time. Nevertheless, Ark didn't leave but instead showed the old man his sack, asking if he really thought it was trash. The hoarder couldn't believe his eyes at what he saw. He could tell at a glance what kind of artifact the young corpse collector had brought him. The young man who used to bring things no more expensive than a few bronze coins was now holding a large fang of a goblin lord in front of him. The old man took the artifact and examined it with some distrust, asking if it was a fake and how did the boy get it. Ark said without hesitation he came to the dungeon and personally killed that goblin. The stunned old man still said he couldn't take the word of the man who was always carrying junk around. The young man had a trump card up his sleeve. He called Mill, and she confirmed it was true. To confirm his words, the protagonist completely untied the bag and dumped a bunch of various artifacts and materials on the table. The hoarder practically didn't say a word and just stared at it silently. A satisfied Ark asked the old man if he would buy, or if they would go to another person who needed it all more. The man looked at the jewelry and said there would probably be an easy buyer for such a big score. The old man panicked and immediately shouted he would buy everything. It would be sacrilege to refuse such valuable materials. The young man smiled and said he hoped his labors would be appreciated. Immediately afterward, Ark and Mill headed to the market to see the protagonist's grandfather. The old man was overjoyed to see his grandson back after a very long time. However, what was his surprise when the boy showed him a sack full of gold coins? Grandpa couldn't believe what he was seeing and immediately asked his grandson where he got that kind of money. Ark replied he was finally able to defeat a very strong monster. After all, the boy immediately smiled at his relative and congratulated him on the occasion. The old man immediately rushed to hug his grandson. The satisfied young man said he was really happy he'd now reached the next level. But suddenly, the protagonist heard some strange noise behind him. Many villagers crowded around the main gate, watching with interest what was happening in the field. Ark said he'd be there soon and asked Grandpa and Mill to wait here. Meanwhile, it was turbulent in the pasture. The village was raided by werewolves. These monsters had already managed to break down several fences and bite residents. One of the monsters pounced on a local villager who tried to run away in tears. The girl wouldn't have succeeded if it hadn't been for Ark, who came in time to cut the werewolf in two with a single blow. After tackling the first monster, he asked the woman if she was okay, to which the terrified fellow villager told him she was fine. The boy looked at the remaining werewolves and wondered what they were. Examining the snarling dog-like monsters, he suddenly thought it basically didn't matter. Striking a confident pose, he shouted to the werewolves they didn't belong here and shouldn't have come. Pulling out his sword and pointing it in the direction of the monsters, Ark muttered these things wouldn't make their way into the village today. After these words, the small group of werewolves was joined by a few more individuals who'd previously been prowling around in another part of the village. Looking at the group of level 8 werewolves, he thought it would be advisable to fight them in a non-village area. Many villagers ran away in panic, shouting it was urgent to call Jar and his group. At that moment, Ark remembered the village's only defenders had just recently fled away. As he looked around the group of werewolves again, he realized that since he'd caused Jar's escape, he would now have to take full responsibility. At that instant, the first werewolves launched their attack. Dodging the werewolves' swift attacks, he thought that since they were level 8, their attacks posed no danger to him. Meanwhile, the monsters gradually began to scatter and, contrary to the protagonist's opinion, didn't concentrate the entire attack on him. On the contrary, they spread out to attack the inhabitants. Seeing this, Ark realized his priority right now was to protect his fellow villagers. If no one intervened in this massacre, sooner or later, all the people would simply be slaughtered. One of the werewolves almost ate the young man who had no way of resisting the fast and strong monster. However, Ark arrived in time, just seconds before the tragedy, saving someone's life. Looking around, he assessed the situation and chose his next target. Nearby was another werewolf, who was also successfully struck by the protagonist's blade. Standing in a fighting stance and surveying the battlefield, the boy asked the man who'd fallen to the ground if he was injured. The shivering villager replied he was fine. To his great surprise, he recognized his rescuer as the corpse collector. Ark replied he didn't care what they called him, but right now he had a job to do. In the next instant, he rushed to where another group of werewolves had gone. The protagonist realized that although the other people still considered him a corpse collector, he couldn't just let them all die. Time after time, the situation was repeated. None of the residents who'd ever seen the corpse collector believed this weakling was now saving their village from ruin. He perfected his movements to the point of automatism, managing to help the poor people in the last moments. Most of the werewolves didn't even have time to react to the approaching strong enemy who hit them clearly in vulnerable points. After hitting the last werewolf, Ark stopped to collect all the levels. To his great surprise, the system increased his rank by another 72 positions. However, by his calculations, there had to be a 10th werewolf still running around somewhere. After killing the entire group of werewolves, the protagonist should have gained 80 levels. It only meant Ark had missed one of the werewolves who was now hiding somewhere. When he looked around, he saw the werewolf had climbed to the roof of the building and had already marked its prey in the form of a little girl. The distance to the target was long, and the protagonist realized he was unlikely to get there in time. At that moment, the monster jumped off the roof and flew toward the defenseless child. There seemed to be no way he could protect one person. Upset, he figured that even with such a high level, he still wouldn't be able to save everyone. It was only seconds before the werewolf fell that the girl saw danger approaching from above. There was no way he could accept that, Ark thought. But the only way out of the situation was to try to throw the sword directly into the monster's body. The risk of this forced measure was greatly increased, but the boy had no choice. With that thought, he drew his sword and swung it like a dart. Taking quick aim, Ark hurled his blade toward the werewolf. The sword flew toward the falling monster at tremendous speed. By sheer luck, the blade entered clearly into the monster's throat. The force of the throw threw the werewolf's body into the wall of the house so that its carcass didn't crush the child. The frightened girl squatted down and clutched her head. As the main character approached her, the child looked up and saw her savior, the corpse collector. She shyly asked Ark if he was really here to save them all, to which the protagonist replied he was. The satisfied kid thanked him heartily for saving the village. Ark, with a smile on his face, waved his hand to the next person he'd saved, inwardly rejoicing he'd managed to keep everyone alive. As he looked around, he suddenly realized the locals now had some serious words for him. There were a lot of people crowded around him, and all of them had questions. A man in a business suit approached the protagonist, saying that on behalf of the village, he was inviting Ark to talk to him. The boy thought to himself these people would surely be unhappy with the fact they'd been saved by some pathetic corpse collector. The representative of the delegation turned to Ark with some nervousness. The protagonist, realizing where this was going, turned around and said he had to go, because he realizes no one here wants to see the face of a corpse collector. But suddenly, the man in the business suit asked him to wait. Ark turned and asked what else they wanted from him. But suddenly, the man thanked him for saving their lives. This turn of events surprised the protagonist very much. People recognized the young man had done an incredible deed, saving many lives, and all this despite the general dissatisfaction with Ark's work. The man in the business suit said that thanks to the hero, none of them were hurt, and the boy himself was ready to sacrifice his life to save them all. So on behalf of all the villagers, the man asked the corpse collector to accept their gratitude. This sudden change in his relationship with the villagers really touched Ark. Suddenly, a woman approached, next to whom was the girl the hero had saved not long ago. The girl looked at her daughter and also personally thanked her child's savior. She bowed to Ark without hesitation. The boy was very embarrassed by this ceremony and asked the woman to raise her head urgently. He added with a smile on his face that all he wanted to do was save everyone. and everything worked out the way it was supposed to. The hero turned to the man in the business suit and said he used to collect loot from corpses, and that, alas, would not change. However, as of late, he'd developed a power that allows him to help people. After looking around at the villagers, Ark said he would now become an adventurer to help the people. So he asked his fellow villagers to look out for him as well, and for that, he would be grateful to everyone. That day, Ark finally went from a pathetic corpse collector to an adventurer who saved an entire village from destruction. The next morning was equally unremarkable. Sleep-deprived people crowded the streets of the village. A girl in a green dress with a red sash was running down the alley. She barely caught up with the protagonist going about his business. The girl said hello to Ark as she walked and wished him a good morning. He turned around in surprise and saw Mill, whom he hadn't caught up with after last night. The girl looked at the protagonist in surprise and asked where he'd put his beautiful armor. The boy smiled and said he'd been wearing the armor of the abyss all along. In that instant, he snapped his fingers to demonstrate his recent find. A second later, the main character was wearing all of his armor. He explained to the girl he'd discovered yesterday he could put on and take off this armor whenever he wanted. The girl clapped her hands and mouthed that it was very cool. Ark looked at his armor again and said with a smile on his face they were the reason he was able to become a true adventurer. The boy remarked he'd been very lucky when he'd found them in the cave. However, the main issue was different. The entire set of equipment he'd found in the dragon's body, but what was the carcass of such a large beast doing in the goblin cave? On the other hand, the boy is unlikely to know the answer to that question anytime soon. Meanwhile, strange events were taking place in the goblin cave. Jar shouted to his group to move faster and get out of here. The assistants ran tearfully, begging the boss to help them. But suddenly, something instantly killed them both. Jar ran, trying not to look back and not realizing what was happening. Losing his mind, he turned around and shouted to the monster across the room what it was doing in this low-level cave. This question sounded in the pitch darkness, from which only a huge yellow eye was visible, staring intently at Jar. Suddenly, the darkness was cut by flashes of electricity. Jar squatted down, realizing he could not escape any longer. His whole body trembling, he didn't believe this was the end. Meanwhile, the eye began to concentrate a huge amount of energy into one point. Moments later, a powerful purple energy beam pierced the cavernous darkness, killing Jar. The rumble of such an explosion was felt even by Ark. Turning around to the direction where the goblin cave was roughly located, he wondered what could have happened there. A few minutes earlier, Jar's group had been chasing a blue cyclops running through the woods near the village. The squad leader lamented they'd almost finished this monster, but now might miss it altogether. His 16th and 17th level subordinates sped up at the order of their captain. Suddenly, the group saw the cyclops run into the goblin cave. This behavior of the monster surprised all three of them. However, there could also be some disadvantages to it. Jar was nervous because while the village had been attacked by werewolves, their group had been elsewhere, and because of that, they'd been fined. Accordingly, killing the Cyclops could have boded well for their monetary reward, which could have helped restore the adventurers' financial health. Now their prey was fleeing through the branching dark corridors of the dungeon. Almost at the entrance, the monster smelled a strong odor of rotting flesh. The Cyclops immediately headed toward the source of that odor. It soon found itself in a large room where the rotten corpse of a dragon lay. After the odor intensified, the Cyclops' body began to shake. Its mouth began to open on its own, and from the looks of it, it could barely restrain itself from pouncing on the dead carcass. The adventurers who entered the corridor heard a chugging sound ahead and headed in the direction of the sound. At a certain point, there was an intimidating sound, not at all like the voice of a Cyclops. Nevertheless, the group continued onward. At some point, all three of them smelled a foul odor of rot. Better ahead of the squad, Jar was suddenly stunned when he saw an unknown monster in front of him. He asked his subordinates if they saw what he saw. To their great horror, in one branch of the cave, the corpse of a huge monster lay on the ground. A cyclops lay on top of it, greedily devouring the rotting flesh. Judging by the expression on its face, it was enjoying the action immensely. Suddenly, the guy in the group muttered something didn't add up here. Indeed, at a certain point, the cyclops' body took on an unknown form that no one in the squad had heard of before. Jar trembled with fear and could not move. For a moment, he thought it was all just a bad dream. A few minutes later, Ark reached the goblin cave. As he'd expected, all the tracks led to this place. The boy realized it wasn't just a strange feeling here, he felt the presence of something unusual. Everything around him said the further journey should continue in the cave. For a moment, the protagonist thought he had a special connection to this place. Suddenly, he heard a long roar followed by a scream inside the cave. At this point, the hero tensed up significantly. It became clear this was not an ordinary case. Walking down the main corridor, Ark plugged his nose. The smell from inside the cave was getting stronger and stronger. There should be a dragon corpse just ahead. But what he saw shocked him beyond belief. Opposite him stood a cyclops of enormous size. 2 human corpses lay at its feet, and it held the third on its outstretched arm. Still, this creature was very different from the usual cyclops. For unknown reasons, it had small wings on its back. As soon as the protagonist entered the hall, the monster immediately noticed him. It was no longer interested in the victim it was holding in its hand. The monster threw the corpse into the wall with incredible force. The monster then turned toward Ark and looked at him fiercely. Its body was of phenomenal size. The boy thought there was no such thing as such a large cyclops. The protagonist didn't expect such a strong and frightening aura. He'd not encountered demons of such a strange form. However, the boy thought he didn't care right now because he was already level 180, and with such a level, it was impossible to lose. Ark decided the best defense was offense, so he decided to attack first before this monster regained its senses. Suddenly, the armor suggested the difference in level between the wearer and the creature was too great, and any battle was recommended to be avoided. The protagonist was greatly surprised and confused by this news. In that instant, before he knew it, the monster gave him the strongest blow to his chest. Ark had never experienced this kind of pain before, and this blow shocked him greatly. The protagonist's body flung backward a few meters into the wall without a word. Falling to the ground, the boy barely tried to get up. His entire body was trembling and aching. He didn't understand how such superiority was possible in such a low-level cave. The system opened an information panel with a recommendation to view the monster's level. It was regrettable Ark hadn't checked his opponent's level first. What he saw shocked him. Opposite him was a creature called the Cyclops of the Abyss. It was currently at level 200. At the same time, the armor warned the enemy was accumulating a huge amount of energy in the head area. The system recommended an urgent retreat. But Ark didn't have the strength to even get to his feet. The repeated requests from the system and armor for the main player to immediately retreat didn't stop, and the monster only seemed to give him a chance. Ark tried to get to his feet with great difficulty, but even if he'd gotten up, it would hardly have changed the final outcome. The boy couldn't believe he'd once again come to this cave that was once again trying to take his life. Suddenly, the system started counting down the seconds until the monster's attack. 7 seconds before the attack, he used his sword to pull himself up. However, there was no strength for further movements. It was the maximum Ark's body could produce at that moment. After a time, the monster emitted a strongest energy beam from its forehead. The flow of energy didn't penetrate the main character's body through, but it fried him and threw him aside. He flew off to the other end of the cave and once again crashed into the wall. It seemed as if his whole body was fractured. The boy was still trying to keep his eyes open, but it was getting harder by the second. A few seconds before passing out, Ark realized that now he'd definitely lost. After the Cyclops stopped emitting a beam of energy, it looked at the defeated enemy. Suddenly, it turned around and headed toward the exit of the cave. Some time passed before the protagonist woke up again. He got up on all fours with great difficulty, thinking about what had happened and why he was still alive. The system alerted that the enemy had left the cave, mistaking Ark for a dead man. After hearing the news, the boy thought the monster was definitely mistaken, although he himself was close to death. The armor alerted the host he was badly injured and needed to use potions to recover. Ark thought he'd completely forgotten about those flasks he'd picked up here in the goblin dungeon. Pulling a vial out of his pouch, he immediately emptied it. The elixir took effect almost instantly, and a few seconds later, the protagonist was on his feet. Wiping his lips, he mentally thanked the goblins for their potions. Looking toward the exit, he realized this monster definitely needed to be caught up with. Otherwise, if this Cyclops reached the village, it could safely single-handedly slaughter all the inhabitants there. Suddenly, a human voice behind him called out to the corpse collector. Ark, who was slowly beginning to wean himself off that nickname, stopped. In addition, the voice of the caller was very familiar. The protagonist turned around to see where the sound was coming from. Directly across from him, leaning against the wall, lay Jar. He was bleeding profusely, and there was a huge hole in the center of his stomach. Suddenly, the adventurer spoke sharply as he noticed the potions Ark was drinking, and demanded he be given one vial. The white-haired guy shouted that for a weakling like a corpse collector, a regenerating elixir was too valuable an item. Jar looked toward Ark with mad eyes and muttered that as soon as he drank the elixir, he would immediately escape. After all, that monster must have gone to the village, and as long as it was distracted, he would be able to survive. Then he demanded the elixir in a commanding tone. Ark continued to remain silent, and Jar tried in agony to get the restorative potions from him. Suddenly, he spit up blood, and his breathing hitched. The boy was silent again. He seemed to have less and less strength left for persuasion. After a few seconds, Jar lowered his head again and began begging Ark for mercy. The pain was unbearable, he said. The protagonist gave a meaningful silence and then asked the Abyss armor if these potions could heal such wounds. The armor replied there was no point, as the wounded man had lost a lot of blood. Besides, the creature had managed to inflict too much lethal damage on Jar, and even using potions would result in a 0 chance of survival. The armor predicted he would die within minutes from massive blood loss. Ark was silent again and then asked the armor the question that had plagued him for a long time. The protagonist asked if the level absorption skill worked on humans, to which he received an affirmative answer from the armor. Now, if he didn't find the strength to rise to his feet, he would definitely be finished. After that, the protagonist told his opponent there was nothing he could do to help him. The blonde man grinned and said he'd realized it a long time ago. Jar shuddered and said he just wanted this pain to finally end. Ark looked at the boy pityingly and said he had one way to put him out of his misery. At that moment, the boy interrupted the corpse collector again and said he wasn't stupid and already understood everything. Then he looked at Ark and said he would have to kill him. The protagonist replied to Jar that in truth, he'd hated the man all his life, and yet, looking back on the past, he would somewhat miss those times. Then Ark swung his blade, and the system alerted to the absorption of Jar's level. The armor wielder had reached level 200. Meanwhile, the Cyclops walked through the forest without any obstacles. After a while, the roofs of houses appeared behind the trees. The monster approached the outskirts of the village. However, it suddenly cried out loudly, and its face turned into a grimace of pain. The monster heard a human voice rejoicing that he'd made it in time. Ark, who was running at high speed, managed to catch up to the Cyclops and struck the monster in a leap. He blocked the path of his opponent, who clutched its bleeding hand in horror. The protagonist decided not to hesitate to take advantage of the advantage he had and lunged at the Cyclops again. As he approached the monster, Ark looked at his opponent in rage and said it would have to die by his hand. He then delivered a powerful slashing blow with his sword. but the monster managed to block the blow. The boy again stepped back some distance and, drawing his blade toward the Cyclops, advised it that it should finish off its enemies. Ark added that because of the monster's gaffe, they now have the same level. He then suggested this fight should end and finally reveal the winner. Unexpectedly, the protagonist said he forgot to add he'd recently killed his old acquaintance with the same hand, so now he was full of rage. A moment later, the Cyclops came to attack first and pounced on Ark. It seemed that with its huge carcass, it would simply run over the young adventurer. But as soon as the monster blinked, it saw the young man was already on its shoulder. Ark was clearly outmatched in speed, which he took advantage of by getting into an advantageous position and counterattacking. Coming in from the back, he attacked the Cyclops, attempting to cut the monster's back. However, the creature's powerful wings were much stronger than the protagonist thought. This only suggested some other tactic should have been used. At that moment, the monster once again began to focus its vision to attempt a powerful shot. Ark noticed this and immediately lashed out at his opponent, shouting he wouldn't allow something like this to happen again. But suddenly, the monster stopped storing energy near its forehead and looked fiercely at the protagonist. The boy realized too late it was a trick. At that instant, the Cyclops straightened its leg sharply, hitting him and throwing him back a few meters. The protagonist managed to block this counterattack, but now he had to defend himself. The monster immediately ripped the nearest tree from its roots and swung it around, trying to kill Ark. The protagonist had no time to react to this unexpected move and parried the blow. After flying a great distance, Ark fell, hitting his back on the ground. He was still conscious and didn't understand why, despite the equality of levels, he couldn't overpower the monster. Taking out a vial of regenerating liquid from his pocket and drinking it, he was surprised at the same time this monster had also used a ruse. Still, having regained his health, Ark rose to his feet and thought this time he wouldn't let the Cyclops win. The boy once again pounced on the monster. The armor again alerted to the huge energy buildup and recommended immediate retreat. The protagonist decided to trust his own instincts, at the same time surprised this monster still didn't calm down. However, this time, the Cyclops wasn't bluffing. A few seconds later, it fired a powerful shot, but this time Ark was ready for anything. It was not without difficulty that he dodged the powerful beam of energy. The boy maintained his speed and, once in a favorable position, swung his sword in hopes of delivering the final blow. After making sure the attack didn't work, the Cyclops decided to cover itself with its wings. It didn't help. However, as Ark put all his strength into his punch, the monster screamed in horror as it realized its wings had been cut. The protagonist saw the result of the attack, realizing he'd finally succeeded in injuring the creature. However, the boy then looked warily at the monster. He was very much surprised by the way the Cyclops behaved in this situation. After the monster realized the danger, it began to stare intently toward the village. Then Ark realized to his horror the Cyclops was going to switch to buildings and inhabitants. In that same second, the monster tensed its legs hard, breaking the ground beneath it. It then made a swift leap with incredible speed, falling to the ground time after time. It kept moving toward the buildings. The protagonist realized the Cyclops wanted to kill all the villagers to regain its strength. He started stalking, realizing he didn't have much time now. Because of his procrastination, the village was in mortal danger. A short while later, residents walking peacefully through the streets discovered a strange creature in the sky. A moment later, it crashed to the ground with a clatter, scaring away the people gathered around it. After the dust cleared, the monster looked around for a few seconds. Then the Cyclops raised its head up and let out a terrible howl, terrifying the villagers. Ark was on the spot a few seconds later. He saw the monster moving down one of the streets. He realized he was late, after all. At that instant, the Cyclops hit one of the nearby buildings with all its might. Residents panicked and ran in different directions, begging for mercy. At the same time, the creature began to accumulate energy near its forehead to use the energy beam again. Ark didn't understand how a Cyclops could use this ability so many times in a row. But before he knew it, the strongest discharge had pierced several buildings. Only then did the hero finally manage to catch up with the enemy, ending up on one of the rooftops. He lunged at the monster in a rage, yelling it was time for it to stop. The Cyclops turned around and tried to block the attack, but Ark managed to get back up, flying under his opponent's arm. The protagonist found himself backstabbing the creature, confident this time he definitely hit it. The monster turned around, hoping to see the boy behind it, but he was no longer there. Ark soared into the air in an attempt to attack the monster from above.